With a single remark about 100% tariffs, Trump abruptly shifted the political climate in Canada. Only moments earlier, Canada had been discussing cooperation and a strategic partnership with the Chinese Communist Party. Moments later, Prime Minister Carney hit the emergency brake, stating on camera that Canada would narrow its approach towards China. More significant than Carney's sudden change of tone, however, was the broader impact of Trump's 100% tariffs threat. The pressure appeared aimed less at Canada itself and more at the CCP's ambitions in North America. On January 20th, Carney delivered remarks at the World Economic Forum in Davos that drew widespread attention. In his speech, Carney said that in recent years, certain major powers have been weaponizing economic integration, using tariffs as leverage, finance and infrastructure as tools of coercion, and supply chains as pressure points against other nations. He also stressed that middle powers such as Canada are not powerless and can help shape a new international order grounded in shared values. Carney stated middle power must act together because if we're not at the table, we're not on the menu. Many observers noted that these remarks were highly unusual. Although Carney did not name any country, his references to weaponized tariff, finance, and supply chains were widely seen as an implicit critique of U.S. economic pressure on mid-sized nations. The speech quickly triggered a sharp exchange across borders. On January 21st, Trump responded forcefully, saying they should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your prime minister yesterday. I wasn't so grateful. Trump also said, Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark. The Golden Dome refers to a layered U.S. missile defense systems designed to detect and intercept incoming missiles, including hypersonic weapons, through a combination of satellites, radar, and ground-based interceptors. Trump has proposed extending the system to Greenland as a key deployment location, but Carney publicly opposed the idea, saying it would pose a threat to Greenland's sovereignty. On January 22nd, Carney responded again, saying Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our own house. This is our own country. It's our future. The choice is up to us. Shortly afterward, Trump announced that if Canada reached an agreement with China, all Canadian goods entering the United States would face immediate 100% tariffs. This statement led many to conclude that China was the central, though unspoken, factor behind the entire dispute. Before attending the Davos Forum, Carney had just concluded a visit to Beijing. In October last year, at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea, Carney met with Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping and accepted Xi's invitation to visit China. This was the first visit to China by a Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade. Before that, China-Canada relations had been largely frozen for almost 10 years, making the sudden thaw especially striking. In coverage by China's state-run Xinhua news agency, the visit was framed as a joint reaffirmation of multilateralism, with language that implicitly criticized the United States. At the same time, the proposed areas of cooperation were unusually broad, spanning trade, energy, agriculture, finance, education, and climate policy, creating the impression of a comprehensive reset in relations. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi went further, suggesting that Carney's visit carried critical and symbolic significance for bilateral ties. Former city councillor in Alberta, Canada, Joseph Shi, said these signals showed that Beijing's invitation was deliberate. He argued that the CCP had spotted emerging tensions between the United States and Canada and sought to widen them, describing the move as an effort to exploit divisions rather than build stable relations. York University professor Shen Jun-Chin said the broader international environment has become increasingly unfavorable for the CCP. Trump is promoting a Monroe Doctrine-style approach aimed at pushing Chinese and Russian influence out of the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, Beijing's partners face mounting pressure. Iran is preoccupied with internal crisis. Nicolas Maduro has been arrested by the United States. And Cuba, without Venezuela's oil support, faces growing economic strain. Under this pressure, Beijing needs partners such as Canada and, if possible, opportunities to widen cracks between Washington and Ottawa. One aspect of the Canada-China agreement drew particular controversy, a trade-off between electric vehicle quotas and canola tariffs. On January 16, after the talks, Carney announced that Canada would set annual import quotas for Chinese EVs starting at 49,000 units and subject to a 6.1% tariff. The quota would gradually rise to about 70,000 units over 5 years. In exchange, China would cut its tariff on Canadian canola from 84% to roughly 15%. Placed in the context of recent tariff disputes, the importance of this exchange becomes clearer. Under the Trudeau government, Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium. China responded with 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and canola meal and 25% tariffs on pork and seafood. In August last year, China raised canola tariffs further, effectively pushing Canadian canola out of the Chinese market. Data show that China's imports from Canada fell 10.4% year-on-year to $41.7 billion US. Although China is Canada's second largest trading partner, its scale is not comparable to that of the United States. Over the past 12 months, China-Canada trade totaled about $80 billion US, while US-Canada trade reached roughly $1 trillion, leaving Canada highly exposed to pressures from the US market. At the same time, Canadian agriculture exports, especially canola, rely heavily on overseas markets and face intense pressure of their own. York University professor Shen Jingqin also pointed to external competition. Late last year, Beijing agreed to allow Australian canola back into the Chinese market, raising the risk of Canada's export space could be squeezed as Australia gains shares. From Carney's perspective, tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles was widely seen as aligned with US policy. As US-Canada relations cooled, he chose to open a limited low-tariff channel for Chinese EVs in exchange for lower canola tariffs, aiming to stabilize the canola market and prevent Australia from taking market share. However, while Carney may see the deal as a gain for Canada, many analysts warn that it could instead draw the country into a strategic trap set by Beijing. Joseph Shi warned that this type of trade-off carries serious risk. He said verbal promises by Beijing to buy agricultural products do not guarantee delivery, citing China's past pledge to purchase US soybeans, which was never fully honored. If the Canadian government encourages farmers to expand canola production on that basis, he argued it would place the entire industry in the hands of a highly politicized buyer that could reverse course at any time. What is open today could be closed tomorrow with a single announcement and a convenient excuse. For farmers, this would tie their livelihoods to a dangerous political lever. Social media commentator Terence Shen echoed these concerns, arguing that Beijing is unlikely to fully open its market to Canada or bring large-scale investment. He said China's real demand for Canadian energy and agriculture products is limited. Once Beijing decides it is no longer gaining enough from Canada or no longer needs Canada in its rivalry with the United States, it could quickly change its stance. His conclusion was blunt. The Chinese Communist Party is the problem itself, not the solution. These concerns are not theoretical. In recent years, Beijing has increasingly used economic pressure as a coercion tool, with greater frequency, harsher methods, and a widening list of target countries. Professor Shen Jingqin added that China has already acted against Canadian canola twice. During the Huawei Men Guangzhou incident, Beijing cited alleged pest contamination this time. It accused Canada of monopolizing canola. The rationale may change, he said, but the pattern is consistent. Political displeasure can quickly be turned into trade retaliation. At the same time, Shen noted that the canola issue is constrained by practical limits. Canada is the world's largest canola exporter, with Australia in second place. Beijing is unlikely to impose heavy restrictions on both suppliers for an extended period, as doing so would effectively cut off its own access to key raw materials. He pointed to a past example in 2020 while the Menwanzhou case and the hostage diplomacy dispute were still unresolved. China quietly erased restrictions and resumed large-scale imports of Canadian canola, at times even pushing prices higher. The reason, he said, was that China's pork industry was recovering from African swine fever and urgently needed canola-related feed inputs. Beyond canola, Canada's decision to open its market to Chinese electric vehicles immediately triggered a domestic backlash. Critics largely agree that while the deal may offer short-term relief for canola exports, It could come at a cost of pushing Canada's auto industry and potentially the broader North American supply chain into a more sensitive position under US scrutiny. Ontario Premier Doug Ford was among the first to speak out. In a social media post, he warned that China had already established a foothold in the Canadian market and would seek to expand further at the expense of Canadian workers' jobs. Ford also cautioned that the imbalance agreement, by lowering tariffs on Chinese EVs, would narrow Canadian automakers' access to the US market, even though the United States remained Canada's largest export destination. Opposition from Canada's automotive industry has been even stronger. General Motors CEO Mary Barra described such market opening as a very slippery slope that could damage North American auto manufacturing, employment, and supply chain security. The head of the Global Automakers of Canada Trade Association said manufacturers' greatest concern is the uncertainty created by the decision, including how the rules will be implemented, whether the policy could expand, and what it may mean for the North American supply chain. U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy also said Canada would eventually regret allowing Chinese vehicles into the market. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer expressed similar views, warning that Canada may ultimately pay a price for the decision. Professor Shen Jing-Chin placed the issue in a broader context, noting that with excess EV capacity in China, rising tariffs in Europe, and existing 100% tariffs imposed by both the United States and Canada, Beijing is urgently seeking new overseas outlets. While the agreement may appear to help Canadian farmers, he said it risks shifting the cost onto automotive workers. More importantly, under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, the most integrated and politically sensitive sector is the automotive industry. US vehicles rely heavily on components from Canada and Mexico, and North American production has long been tightly interconnected. Political disputes may intensify, but supply chain realities cannot be severed overnight. As a result, if Canada moves too close to Beijing, the United States is likely to use this issue as leverage in future USMCA negotiations, placing Canada in a weaker and more constrained position at the table. Joseph Xi's assessment was more direct. Canada is likely to regret this move. First, it risks alienating countries that are taking defensive or punitive measures against Chinese electric vehicles, especially the United States. At the same time, China's own economy is under strain and may not deliver meaningful market opportunities for Canada. Any short-term gains could fail to materialize, while US dissatisfaction could surface quickly, potentially affecting Canada's standing within the North American trade framework. Second, she extended the risk to safety and quality concerns. If large numbers of Chinese EVs enter Canada, incidents such as fires or mechanical failures would ultimately be borne by Canadian consumers and road safety systems. If Chinese capitals were further allowed to establish factories in Canada, persistent issues tied to capital structures and management practices could make quality control and workplace safety difficult to fully resolve, disrupt market order, and ultimately harm domestic industries. Against this backdrop, Trump's threat of imposing 100% tariffs on Canada may have been aimed less at punishing Canada itself than at blocking Beijing from using Canada as a gateway into the North American market, while closing off attempts to exploit US-Canada tensions. This raises a key question. What impact would such a move have on China? For Beijing, Trump's use of 100% tariff as maximum pressure prompted Carney to narrow cooperation. The real loss is not the failure of one or two agreements, but the simultaneous tightening of access to North America, strategic flexibility, and geopolitical leverage. Under the earlier approach, China could have used Canada's lower tariffs and limited quotas as a foothold for EVs, first establishing sales channels, after-sales service networks, parts warehouses, financing options, and certification systems, the basic infrastructure for operating in North America. But if Canada tightens quotas, increases scrutiny, reduces subsidies, avoids government procurement, and takes a more cautious stance towards Chinese investment, that path will steadily narrow. The result will be higher cost, slower timeline, and greater difficulty for Chinese automakers entering North America, forcing them to redirect capital and resources elsewhere. Canadian political commentator Terence Shen noted that Chinese companies' ability to compete on price relies heavily on low domestic cost and government subsidies. Once production moves to Canada, those advantages will likely disappear. More critically, the threat of 100% tariffs leaves Canada with little room to maneuver. Given its reliance on the US market, tariffs at this level makes it impossible for Canada to treat China as a counterweight to the United States. Beijing's attempt to exploit US-Canada friction and use Canada as leverage would quickly fail, pushing Canada more firmly back into the North American camp. Looking ahead, the space for negotiations over agricultural products and natural resources would also shrink. Beijing has often used tariffs and market access as bargaining tools, but once Canada is tightly bound to the US market, this approach loses effectiveness. Issues such as canola are more likely to remain short-term, conditional deals rather than evolve into stable long-term cooperation. At the core of the issue is China's need to enter the US and broader North American market to ease overcapacity and weak domestic demand. North America offers stronger consumer demand and higher margins, allowing faster returns and relief from domestic price wars. A foothold would also enable firm to build distribution, after-sales service, regulatory compliance, and financing systems while gaining influence over standards and reducing geopolitical risk. Under tighter tariffs and scrutiny, however, this path has largely been closed. Beyond the economic impact, there is also a less visible but significant loss in image and international perception. China's state-run Xinhua News Agency sought to frame the meeting as a sign of warming ties and broad cooperation. Yet Carney's subsequent emphasis on limited engagement and his rejection of advancing a free trade agreement cooled that narrative, making clear where Canada's core economic dependence lies and which power ultimately holds decisive leverage. For Beijing, this removes a useful example for public messaging and makes it harder to argue that Western countries are cooperating, reducing its ability to ease international concerns over overcapacity and economic pressure.